not buy a used car from that guy. Welcome everybody to our monthly Zoom meeting, and hope everybody is well and healthy. And a couple of notes about our logistics. All of the microphones will be muted except those that uh, of the speakers and the moderators. And there's a uh, icon at the top of your screen, and select view options, then select side by side mode from the list up there. And what that does is gives you the best visual on your screen. And at any time, questions can be submitted using the chat icon at the bottom of the panel. And those questions come directly into me, and especially during the speaker presentation, I will do the Q&A based on what questions that you have. Okay, we're going to start with a chaplain's report with Steve Kolda, and we have a couple of things to report there. Greg is going to do the joke of the day. I'm going to give you a branch status. We've had some changes this week, so we will go over all those changes. And John Mill will do the awards, the birthday boys, and the speaker and events update. And then Michael Lee is going to do the activity groups update. Randy Wong will introduce our speaker, who is Brandon Tachco. And Brandon is going to talk to us on ships in the Balcutha over in San Francisco Bay. It's going to be quite interesting. And then, oh, this must be a typo. I thought Mike was going to sing Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley, but I guess he changed it to God Bless America. So we're going to have that at the end. And a special drawing where 3 of our winners will get a nice little check, and we'll close the meeting. Now we're going to, as we have in the past, we're going to keep the meeting open for about 20 minutes, which is kind of an open chat room. And in the past, the speakers have stayed around and answered more questions. So be sure and hang around for that. Okay, we got a couple of new members. Welcome Don Davis of San Ramon. And this guy's interested in about everything. Look at that. He's got 11 things that he likes to do. He must be a busy guy. And Larry Oliver of Alamo. And he's got about 6 or 7 interests here. I didn't even know we had a gardening group, do we? I guess we do. Because there it is. Okay, welcome, guys. And good to have you on board. Okay, Steve, your invocation and chaplain's report, please.
Okay, good morning, everybody. The chaplain's report is there a slide for the names?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we want to make sure that everybody keeps these people and their families in their thoughts and prayers, Barry and Jim. And also, you might want to keep in your minds and thoughts the people who we don't know who have contracted the disease. I have not heard of anybody in the SIR community who has contracted the disease, but you just don't know. And I'm glad to hear that so many have had their shots. So that's good news. That makes this a good report. And I'd like to begin with a prayer for protection, considering what's going on. We pray you, Master, be our help and protection. Save the afflicted among us, have mercy on the lowly. Raise up the fallen, show yourself to those in need. Heal the sick and bring back those who have strayed. Fill the hungry, give freedom to prisoners. Raise up the weak, console the faint-hearted. Let all peoples acknowledge that you alone are God. We are your people, the sheep to whom you give pasture. We ask this in the name of the Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Steve. If any of your members out there know of any of our members that have contracted COVID, we'd appreciate you dropping us a line so we can mention it. But right now, as Steve mentioned, we don't know of anybody that has it in our group. And as you know, this is my favorite part of the meeting, and this is where we honor all of these guys with due respect. And you probably don't know this, but the last week they all went down together to get their second COVID shots, and the COVID shots went real well. However, as luck would have it, they all came down with the flu bug, and they're not with us today. So get well, guys, and hope to see you next month. Okay, back from, oh, wait a minute. We got, yes, I forgot. Brandon Tachco, a PhD historian of the San Francisco Maritime Museum, is going to talk to us about the shipping and specifically the Balclutha in San Francisco Bay. So welcome, Brandon. Glad you're with us. Okay. Greg was up in Reno doing one-night stands, and we were hoping that he'd get snowed in up there, but he made it out. And Greg, it's all yours, buddy. Take it away.
Hey, you know, you're joking about us all going down to get the shots at the same time, but you know, for the sake of economy, we all use the same needle. So anyway, you know, it was the Olympic gold medal final in wrestling. And Ole, the Norwegian, was going to wrestle the Russian. And the coach was telling Ole, he says, don't let him get you in the pretzel hold. If he gets you in the pretzel hold, it's all over. He says, the Russian has never lost a match where you got somebody in the pretzel hold. So the match starts, and boy, within 10, 15 seconds, the Russians got Ole in the pretzel hold. The crowd is just, oh, there's a moan from the crowd, and the coach just puts his head down, and you know, and all of a sudden there's this blood-curdling scream, and the Russian flies 3 feet off the mat, lands on his back. Ole topples on top of him and pins him for the win. Ole goes back to the coach and he says, well, what was that? And he says, well, he says, I was just about to black out. I had just a little bit of energy left, and I saw a pair of testicles in front of me. So with my last bit of strength, he says, I bit down as hard as I could. And the coach says, is that what finished the Russian off? He says, no. He said, but it's amazing how much strength you get when you bite your own nuts. So the other one's a little Johnny joke. We haven't had a little Johnny joke in a long time. So the teacher is asking the class to use the word fascinate in a sentence. So Sally raises her hand and said, you know, we went to my uncle's farm and we saw the sheep and the different animals and stuff, and I was fascinated. So the teacher said, no, Sally, he said, that's fine, but I asked you to use the word fascinate, not fascinated. So little Mary raises her hand, and little Mary says, oh, my parents took me to Rock City last week and it was fascinating. And the teacher says, well, Mary, you know, I asked you to use the word fascinate, not fascinating. And little Johnny's back there pumping his hand up and down, but the teacher is hesitant to call on Johnny because she's been burned before. But she thinks, you know, how can he mess up the word fascinate? So she finally calls on him and he says, you know, my Aunt Carolyn has a sweater with 10 buttons on it, but her tits are so big she can only fascinate.
That's great. Thanks. Good ones, buddy. Okay, here's a little update on what we're doing and where we're going and when we're going to reopen. And all activities, outdoor activities, specifically the golf, the hiking, and the biking, are now open pending state CER protocols, which is an insurance requirement. And it's really basically what we've been doing, mask, hand sanitizers, social distancing, and things like that. And also our board, the branch board, has to approve it, which we will get that approval. This just came out a couple of days ago. The only outdoor activity that's not approved is bocce. So biking, cycling, and all the golf activities are now open, and stay tuned with your activity leaders on future gatherings and how you register on the website. Okay. This is a copy of the first page or the home page on our website. And we've got about 8 links to the county and to the health providers about where to get vaccinations. And this is pretty good. We've had it up there for a few weeks, and we've got several good comments from members who have, through these links, have gotten appointments and shots. And it's updated on a regular basis, and it's on the homepage of our website, and that's an actual copy of what's on there. So if you're looking for links, go to the homepage and you can link into any of those. Okay. We're going to have our, we had a survey a couple of weeks ago to gauge what you felt about returning to meetings. And Dan Poland, who did the survey, is here to give us the results. Dan, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, John. Hi, guys. Let me just start off by saying we had a pretty good response to the survey. About 35% of the active members, about 113 people actually responded. It was a fairly straightforward survey, a limited number of questions, and the intent was to try and get some sense of how our members were feeling about the eventual in-person, return to in-person activities, luncheons, and events. We know it's still early, but a lot of us are still trying to do the planning for these events in the future, including the luncheons. The first question generally just requested or asked people to respond to how they felt about coming back to in-person luncheons, and 80% responded that they were very willing to come back. A large number of those people had caveats like people should have vaccinations and kind of social distancing practices should be employed. But the response was pretty overwhelming and probably representative of the rest of the branch in terms of those that do attend lunches. When asked kind of a supplemental question about how soon people should return, how soon we should return to the lunches, it was about half, about 43% thought it would be May, June, July timeframe, sooner rather than later. The remainder of the folks were kind of, let's wait and see. It's too early to tell. Maybe certainly by mid to late summer might be the right time to come back. On the events side, we posed the question about how much interest there was in doing an outside in-person event like our barbecue, which started last year. And 70% of the respondees indicated that they would attend, again, with the caveat that people are vaccinated. On the 2 other major events, the ladies' luncheon and the holiday party, questions 4 and 5, basically there was less interest at this point. And I think it was more related to, it's still too early to tell whether or not getting together like that makes sense and whether or not it's something that we can even consider this year. So only about 45% of those responding indicated they would go to the ladies' luncheon. 37% said they would not go. And then there was a little higher number of people who would go to the holiday party, but a larger number of people who responded no, that kind of a smaller number of undecided. So those were the basic questions, and then people had the opportunity to put comments in. And basically kind of the comments, the predominant themes were, return to normal when it's safe for all. Probably still a little too early to know, given vaccines are just starting to roll out, what the right timing is for that. And it's better to err on the side of safety. So that was kind of the general feeling out of the comments that I kind of sorted through. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions about the survey. Back to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I've said this before, I've said it every month at these meetings, I'm going to say it again. We are determined to not return to anything until it's 100% safe to do so. So you expect that, and we owe that to you. So that won't happen until it's safe. We're going to continue our monthly drawing. 3 names will be drawn from the Zoom meeting participation list, and each lucky guy will receive either $1 million or 25 bucks from Treasurer Gerald Story. I'm not real sure, but I think it's more $25. So that will be at the end of the meeting. So John Knoll, take it away, buddy.
Hey, thank you, John, and welcome everyone to our February meeting. One of the things that we try to do as a board is to recognize activities and work and things that people do that's really beyond expectations and goes far beyond what people would ask anyone to do. And we'd like to recognize today Mike Sorensen for his work with the Wine Fellowship. Mike, thank you so much for all the work that you've done. Mike has gone out of his way to schedule a weekly wine meeting, and he has kept it interesting and fun and lively. He has delivered wine to people who have ordered it through the website. He has set up activities, gotten together with people. Michael, we appreciate your help and thank you for making life with Sir 128 Wine Group a lot better for all of us. Thank you, Michael. Secondly, we recognize now that there's a lot of people doing things beyond our expectations, behind the scenes, and kept making our lives better during this COVID time. And we as a board would like to have a certificate of appreciation to these individuals, to Dan and Robert for their work on Golf Buddies, for Al, Paul, and Denny for their work on the book club, Bill Corbett for keeping the cycling buddies going, and for Turner to keep the hiking buddies, and Michael Levine for keeping Zoom going with investments, Joe Velson, the STEM group, and George for the tennis group, and Michael for keeping activities in front of everybody. Thank you, guys. It's very much appreciated. Very much appreciated. There are 4 longevity awards. We've got 4 guys who are celebrating their 5th anniversary. Jim McEwen, Rich Richardson, Ken Sturba, and Joe Velson. Joe, you're really getting a lot of playtime here. Congratulations on your 5 years. And now we come to the birthday boys. And guys, this is a short month, only 28 days, and there's 31 guys involved here. Very popular month for birthdays. And I want to point out that our dearly departed friend, Jim Powers, and I shared a birthday. And Jim, being the kind guy that he was, every time he saw me, he collaborated and talked about, joking about us sharing that birthday. I'll be missing you, Jim. Got a couple of big sirs in here, Frank Minook and Greg Grebe. We've got a lot of board members, a good group. Congratulations, and cue it up, Danny.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy birthday
to you.
And many more on Channel 4. And Frankenstein on Channel 9. And I don't know anymore.
Thanks, Dan. Our speaker schedule coming up. In March, we're going to have Jim Ian, who is a retired NBA coach. And his time on the NBA was with Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. And we'll hear some stories about Scottie Pippen and Shaq O'Neal and things of that sort. Be kind of fun. And in April, we have David Seberg coming, and David is going to talk to us about climate change, how it's affecting us and our surroundings, and what we can look forward to. So we'll look forward to that in April, and we're looking at May and June schedules later on. And lastly, I wanted to talk about our events, and we do plan to have a branch barbecue this year. We'd like to kick things off. We tentatively have it set in August, only because we have to make some kind of plans. We would have all of our wives and every member invited, and we would not limit it to a certain amount. We would continue to get tables set up so we could have as many members to that event as possible. We're looking at that in early part of August. We have the ladies luncheon tentatively set for the 30th of September. And again, this is all dependent upon what we can learn from the state and local guidelines and vaccinations. And we are planning in advance to talk about having a holiday dinner dance in the first week in December. Now, in terms of monthly events that we normally have scheduled on our website, we're only looking right now to talk about outdoor events. We may be able to schedule some hikes or some walking tours or some outdoor locales. If we can get things set up, you will be notified immediately via emails and our website. And we are planning to have some kind of a schedule of events so that we can implement it very, very quickly once we get back into a state of normalcy. We would like to continue on having good times and getting together, and we're only going to do that when we have the proper protocols in place. Now, I'd like to have Mike Lee fill us in and get us up to date on all the things that are going on. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. All right, let's talk about the activities update. As you know, as Big Sur mentioned, Contra Costa County has returned to the purple tier, so outdoor social gatherings are now permitted, obviously, following the coronavirus requirements. So you've got the website there if you have any questions. So let's talk about who's Zooming right now. The AM Book Group will be Zooming on Monday, March 1st at 9:30 to discuss Shantaran by Gregory David Roberts. It's about a convicted Australian bank robber and a heroin addict who escape from prison and flee to India. Interesting. If you're interested in joining the Zoom meeting, just let Al know. The Evening Book Club will discuss News of the World by Paulette Giles on March 16th, which tells of a fictional Civil War captain who travels through Texas to inform a hungry public about current events. It's a New York Times bestseller and now a movie starring Tom Hanks. Book Club 3 is reading The Cipher by Isabella Maldonado. It's a riveting thriller about an FBI agent who comes under attack, and they will review it virtually on February 24th at 3 p.m. The fishing group is still conducting a monthly Zoom meeting, but they've also received permission to resume their outdoor fishing activities while following COVID-19 protocols. Couples golf started up again on February 18th at the 9-hole par 3 course at Las Positas. They have a socially distanced, no-host lunch afterwards. The 9-hole golf group is playing at Pleasanton Golf Center every Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting. They practice social distancing and have a great time out on the course. Tuesday Golf has resumed normal operations. In addition to all the usual courses, the group is adding Wente and Oakhurst this year. You can see the schedule and sign up on their activity webpage. And Thursday Golf is now meeting. Well, it's not meeting for now as Jim Briggs is taking over the leadership of the group from Mike Young, but they will meet soon. A Zoom meeting of the investing group will be held on February 24th at 1:30 with members of the group demonstrating how they interact with various websites, including Schwab and Fidelity. Would you be interested in joining a virtual men's health group? Some of the topics we could cover include fun exercise for senior men, exercising at home, strength training for seniors, balance management, fall prevention, weight management, and whatever else the group wants to cover. I would be the activity leader as I'm a certified personal trainer, a senior exercise specialist, and I'm certified in nutrition. If you're interested in forming this group, contact Alan Schroeder, Branch Activities Chairman at aldora64@aol.com. In February, the STEM group had Sir Bill Olmo provide an update on his DNA testing and research experience with Ancestry.com. A copy of that presentation can be downloaded from the STEM activities page on our website. In February, the Wine Fellowship tried tasting the oldest Zinfandels they could find and discovered that they were still good, despite the fact that experts say they can only be kept for a few years. Also in February, they explored the impact that time, oxygen, and gas has on wine. You could join them every Wednesday at 4 p.m., where they explore different varietals, regions, and countries. For more information about any activity, sign on to the activities page of our website at sir128.com. Now here's Randy Wong to introduce today's speaker. Randy?
Good morning, guys. And guess who might be joining us today? Just a reminder, at the bottom of your screen, click on the chat icon. A chat window will open and select to everyone and type your question. Our big Sir John Kent will review and ask the questions on your behalf. Now, shifting gears this month from politics, economics, and health and sports, our speaker today is Mr. Brandon Tachco, who has a PhD in world and maritime history from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Honolulu. I first met Brandon when he was we gave a guided tour of the Maritime National Park Association. He was at that time a research and development coordinator for the San Francisco Maritime National Park, where he led experimental education programs aboard the historic ships and was the managing editor for the membership maritime history publication, The Sea Letter. He gave our service group an excellent guided tour of the Maritime National Park and the square rigger ships that played an important part in the maritime history of the 1800s and 1900s. He is an expert on one square rigger in particular, the Belclutha, which we toured from stem to stern. May I present Dr. Tachco, who will describe what life was like on the Belclutha and its role in maritime history in the Pacific and the world.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Randy, for the introduction and for inviting me today. And thank you all for having me and for joining here. I am very, very excited. I don't get to do talks like this as often recently, so I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy it, and I especially look forward to the any feedback or questions that you might have for me and discussing those at the end. So to start off, well, whenever I tell people that I study world history, a common response is, wow, that's a lot of history. And indeed, studying the history of the world sounds impossibly vast and often can be. But contrary to how it sounds, world history is not the history of everything that ever happened everywhere in the world. Instead, world history looks at specific historical themes that are common to all humans. These themes blur the lines that we have drawn between different nation states and peoples. So I like world history because it challenges many of our preconceptions and understandings of the world and complicates labels that we have created and prescribed to the people in it. In short, world history shows how very similar we all are and how much we are all connected. So this is what drew me to ships. Whether made for war or trade, ships often survived through multiple owners, names, and purposes, and so represented the lives of many people from many different classes, races, nationalities, and creeds. As such, ships represent a maritime space that is uniquely and amazingly international, multicultural, and world historical. This maritime space is one that has been essential for so much of our history, and yet there are still so many that often take it for granted. So, for those who live in the Bay Area, you're very familiar with the sight of massive cargo ships like this one streaming across the bay. Even so, in our present age dominated by air travel, it is easy to forget how much we depend on ships like these for most of the goods and comforts that we enjoy daily. The technology we use, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, most of it was certainly on one of these behemoth cargo ships at one point before it reached our homes. These goods represent an immense global maritime trade network. Though often taken for granted, this network connects people from across the globe through a complex web of ships, shipbuilders, materials, companies, investors, laborers, politicians, and consumers. Now this is the square-rigged steel-hulled sailing ship Balclutha, which is now a museum ship in San Francisco. Balclutha represents the origins of today's global shipping system as it existed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. San Francisco, along with countless other cities and regions around the world, owes its very existence to ships like this one. In many ways, ships are like people. Some have long, productive lives full of travel and experience. Some live long and uneventful lives. Some have lives that are short and tragic. And some live lives that end mysteriously. Balclutha has been fortunate enough to live a long and eventful life working across 3 productive careers. It sailed around Cape Horn 17 times and visited every continent except Antarctica. And by the end of its voyaging, it had traveled more than 440,000 miles in its lifetime. Just to add some context, that is nearly enough to have traveled to the moon and back. So imagine sailing to the moon and back. So that leaves a whole lot of interesting history to discuss, and my book project tries to get at most of it. But in the interest of time, my presentation today will look generally at 2 aspects of Balclutha's history. We'll begin by talking about Balclutha's birth and discuss the connection its construction in Glasgow has with the geopolitical and labor world of the 19th century Southeast Asia. We'll then take a look at the people that lived and worked aboard with special focus on the multinational nature of the ship. The emphasis will be on those whose livelihood somehow depended on ships like Balclutha, either directly or indirectly, and how they are now all connected across space and time through the commonality of the ship. So, to begin, Balclutha was born in 1886 on the River Clyde in Glasgow. It was built by the dockyard company Charles Connell and Company for Robert Macmillan. Macmillan was also a Glaswegian shipbuilder with a dockyard just a few miles down the river from the Charles Connell yard. Macmillan owned ships as a side investment and commissioned the Balclutha with the hopes of profiting from the then booming wheat trade with California. Now, wheat was one of the first that would become a long line of agricultural products grown in California's Central Valley, an industry that, of course, California still depends on for its economic success today. For decades, immediately following the gold rush, this agricultural boom in Northern California precipitated a boom in merchant ship construction halfway around the world in Glasgow, where cargo ships like Balclutha were being built to accommodate this trade. Wheat would be loaded in San Francisco and sailed around the southern horn of South America, one of the most dangerous shipping passages in the world, to England and Europe, where wheat was needed. Then the ships would return with a variety of British and European goods, but mostly coal, which would be used to light and warm California metropolises like San Francisco and power the steamships of San Francisco Bay. Sometimes this coal would even be reloaded to other ships and exported across the Pacific to China and Japan, as was the case with Balclutha's first ever load of coal. So a ship, therefore, is a very complex commodity in itself, built to transport commodities. And in itself, it is made of many smaller commodities, which makes it to me a very interesting topic. From the smallest nail to the largest steel plating, each piece of a ship has its own story and history, connecting people through global chains of business and labor. Tracing the chains for each of these materials will be a monumental task. So today I will focus on one in particular, teak wood, as the key example for the complex global networks that were required for some of these materials. The story of the teak that was required for Balclutha's construction connects Balclutha and Glasgow to other people, world regions, and geopolitical situations in ways that are not often acknowledged or imagined. Though much of Balclutha is steel and iron, wood is still a very important part of its construction. There were many different types of timber that became a part of Balclutha, including different pines, mahogany, elm, oak, maple, and teak. And if you look at the image on the right there, that's the after cabin where the officers would have spent most of their time. It's very ornately decorated, many different types of wood. It's a good example of just the various woods that we used even on ships like this one. Teak in particular is an important hardwood that is very resistant to rot, even when placed next to iron and steel. So it's especially useful for parts of the ship that would suffer the most weather and wear. This included many of the margins of the ship, such as skylights, animal pins, deckhouse, and chart house doors, and all of the ship and ladder railings. And the image on the left here, taken from the foredeck looking aft, sort of gives a good idea of general all the kinds of wood. The deck itself would have been mostly pine, but after pine, the most used wood would have been teak. And you can see some examples with the railing here, that's all teak. The railing on the very ends of the port and starboard are all teak. The midship house there, the galley house, is actually made of iron. But all the doors alongside it would have made of teak and so forth. Though prevalent in many tropical regions in the world today, teak is indigenous to just a few areas in South and Southeast Asia, specifically present-day India, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. It was not introduced to other parts of the world, like Africa and South America, until the early 20th century, which means the teak that became a part of Balclutha had to have come from one of the areas to which it is indigenous. By the 1880s, when Balclutha was constructed, the main supply of teak from Malabar and India's west coast had been nearly depleted, and European companies had not yet created solid connections with teak suppliers in Thailand and Laos. So Balclutha's teak was most likely from Burma, or present-day Myanmar. This connects Balclutha to a region dominated by, at the time, what I call an empire of teak. The history of this empire of teak is a history of conflict and cooperation between private business, the British state, and local elites. So to start off, the British East India Company, which many people have heard of, ruled over India for over 200 years. And this is important to mention here in terms of talking of companies and things like that, because people often forget that it was a company, it was a private company that ruled over India for so long. It was them that organized and expanded the extraction of teak from forests in India. Then, after a nearly successful Indian rebellion against the company in 1857, the British government disbanded the East India Company and took direct control of India. This brought many aspects of British state bureaucracy to India, including a forestry conservation department. The forestry department had developed in Britain as a response to the rapid depletion of oak forests in the British Isles, which was due to the huge demands of keeping up a powerful navy of entirely wood-hulled ships. The purpose of this department, therefore, was to control the extraction of lumber and conserve it for state use. This was its purpose in India as well, where by the time the British state took over, much of the teak in India was already largely depleted. So individuals whose business it was teak export were in direct conflict with the forestry department, since their main purpose was to keep up with the teak market demand and make money. Therefore, in order to escape the strict restrictions on teak extraction from the forestry department, these private businessmen and investors began to look elsewhere for their supply of teak, leading them to Burma, where teak was also indigenous and still plentiful. They contracted with local elites for the right to harvest and sell teak. The Burmese elites agreed, as long as they were compensated with a healthy percentage of the profits. One company that made such a deal was the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation. Founded in 1863, the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation became a quick success, and by the 1870s, it was by far the largest exporter of teak in Burma. In the early 1880s, however, the King of Burma began to demand more from their deal. By this time, the company's wealth had given it quite a bit of power and influence in London. This allowed the company to lobby Parliament and convince them to go to war with Burma once again, leading to the Third Anglo-Burmese War and the final complete annexation of Burma in 1885. So the company had gotten what it wanted, but of course, now the British state was in control of Burma, just as it had taken control in India, and with it came the forestry department. So from there, teak exporters began to look into even other places where the British government was not, like Siam or present-day Thailand. So from here, I thought I'd just show, this is a modern teak forest. Today, most teak plantations, and as I mentioned, they're really all over the world, all tropical regions today. And it's very much plantation style. It is very difficult to find what's called like old growth teak anymore. Teak now is grown specifically so that it grows quicker, not as long, so it can easily be harvested more quickly. And I thought I'd show a neat little, that's kind of what they look like today. Wanted to show you a couple pictures. These are some pictures from the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation of some Europeans enjoying themselves. This guy's lounging around. He is in Burma. Here's a group of some European workers as well with some locals. Quite a difference in terms of who seems happy to be there and who doesn't. So given the size and strength of Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, it is likely them that originally extracted Balclutha's teak. Extracting and processing teak took a lot of hard work from a variety of different people. One such person was Alfred MacDonald, an example of one of these Europeans we see here. He was a Glaswegian specifically, who was hired by the company to be a forest assistant, traveling all over Burma, managing the various extraction camps, paying their workers, and managing the lumber mill process. According to MacDonald, teak extraction and processing worked in seasons. The teak would be felled in the dry season, and logs would be placed in creeks or creek beds, where once the rainy season began, the logs would flow with the streams to the river. Here's an example of that. The streams, of course, would grow quite a bit during the rainy season, and all the logs would go down the river. They would then be lashed together to create rafts of about 100 logs. These rafts were floated downriver all the way down to the end of the river to the ocean, where there were sawmills and where they would then be processed and finally shipped out. So to complete these difficult and arduous tasks, company managers like MacDonald relied on the labor of elephants at every step. These animals and their handlers, some examples here of them creating the logs and the streams, they're the ones who did the real work in this industry. The company tried to invent various machines to help them fell and carry the logs, but because the areas where teak was founded were so rocky and mountainous, none of these machines would work properly. This meant that the European company managers like MacDonald who had no knowledge of elephants or the training, had to rely on local knowledge and labor to extract and process teak. Some of these locals became very successful businessmen as a result. One such example was a man named Ba O. In a series of letters written between him and the company directors, he explained his intention to retire from the elephant business. Apparently, along with many other successful investments, he had earned more money than he knew what to do with, quite literally. The directors, in communication with each other, understood this wanting to retire, but were very concerned for losing this important contact, which demonstrates how important local labor and business was to their success. Ba O assured them that he would secure future contracts for them before he retired. We have some more pictures of elephants. This is an elephant. This is all from the same company archives. An elephant being loaded onto a ship. And it looks very, very uncomfortable and unhappy, understandably. Again, another elephant being loaded onto a ship. And here we have another example of elephant being worked by local handlers, bringing the logs around the creek. Another example here, they were even used towards the end. So these are actually processed logs that are then being ready and prepared to load up for the ships. So I really want to focus on these people. The people are especially important. As I said, the people that are livelihoods dependent on Balclutha. And the ship, of course, is nothing without the people connected to it. And as the story of Balclutha's teak shows, even before birth, Balclutha was already connected to many people who depended on it for their livelihoods. Once constructed and sent around the world, Balclutha also became home to many different people from many different national, cultural, linguistic, and ethnic backgrounds. So starting off with the captains and officers. were usually of mixed European descent and often came from long lines of ship captains, many, many generations of ship captains. And many people don't realize, but many captains also often brought their wives and their children along with them on voyages. This was also the case with Balclutha, of course, and Balclutha also serves an example of how people were born on ships while at sea. Here, Inda Francis. Inda Francis was born in the middle of the Indian Ocean while Balclutha was sailing from India back to San Francisco. She was named Inda in recognition of the ocean in which she was born, and Francis in recognition of the ship's destination, which is a very transnational name representing the transnational space in which she entered the world. Then next, of course, the seamen and regular crew. While mostly of European descent, the crew came from all over around the world. Again, there are many examples, but the ship's cook is an especially interesting one. A ship's cook was not part of the usual ship hierarchy in the same way that the seamen were. The cook could be the most popular or the most hated member of the crew, depending on their skill. If their skill was high, the reverence for the rest of the crew was great. Captain Alfred H. Durkee, who we already saw a picture of, was captain of Balclutha from 1894 to 1899, and the father of the aforementioned Inda Francis reminisced about sea cooks in his personal papers, which he wrote after his retirement. Durkee described a reverence for one steward of Chinese descent in particular, who cooked for him while he was captain. Now, this example of a cook or steward of Chinese descent is not an outlier. Actually, the position of cook or steward could often be filled by someone of non-European descent, their background depending on the ship's current trade route. For example, if the ship was trading mainly in the Atlantic or Caribbean, the cook might likely be of African descent. If the ship was trading with China, the cook might likely be Chinese. In the case of Balclutha, when it was sailing across the Pacific with us and trading with Australia and India, one such cook was a man named John Ah Sing. According to this crew list from 1901, Ah Sing was originally born in China, but the location of his wife or next of kin was in Honolulu. Balclutha made stops in Honolulu during its trans-Pacific career and was even briefly registered under the Hawaiian flag. So it makes sense for any of its crewmen to have had their home there. Though, in looking at this particular crew list, it is clear that sailors made their homes all over, including in this case, places very far from the Pacific, such as Sweden and Germany. Interestingly, though, the career when life aboard Balclutha was the most international was the career when Balclutha was, at least on the surface, the least globally active. So from 1902 to 1930, while serving as an Alaskan salmon packing ship, Balclutha, which was called Star of Alaska for most of this career, spent at least half of its time docked at the Alaska Packers Association's dockyard in Alameda. Its job at this point was to transport materials and workers up to Alaska during the salmon fishing season, which lasted just a few months from late spring to early fall. Though Balclutha's travel, which much less global, centered only on a small portion of the northeastern Pacific, it was a part of an industry that was very global. For one, the salmon that was caught and canned during these trips was sold all over the world. It was a big business. But also, the people involved in this industry, who lived and worked on Balclutha during this period, came from all over and were representative of transnational Pacific migrations. During this time, Balclutha went from housing 30 to 35 people, which was about the usual people needed to crew the ship, went from housing 30, 35 to housing over 200, depending on the year. This included the sailors, the fishermen, and the 125 or so canners. The sailors were of mixed European descent as before, but usually British, American, or Scandinavian. The fishermen were usually Italian and sometimes also Scandinavian. The canners were mostly Chinese, especially at first, but also eventually over half Filipino and Mexican. Captain C. Johansson, who was captain from 1914 to 1920, recalled the international environment of the ship during this period. In the scene he describes, walking just 100 feet across the deck was like walking from region to region. Each group of workers had different languages, different smells, different games, different music, and different dances. He seemed to particularly enjoy watching the games and dances of the canners. Of course, this rather pleasant and peaceful international scene that Johansson depicts isn't the entire truth. The white sailors and fishermen were bunked up on the main deck of the ship, while the canners were forced to bunk down below with the cargo. Also, while the sailors and fishermen were hired directly by the Packers Association, the canners were contract laborers, which meant much less pay and much worse working conditions, for which the Packers Association could claim they were not responsible. John Tenier, a Canadian who got a job working in the galley of Balclutha, or Star of Alaska at this time, took the time to get to know the canners and wrote about the experience in his memoirs. According to him, the canners were getting paid as little as $50 a season, while for his work in the galley, Tenier was paid $55 a month.
So they can hear you.
Tenier's pay also included free food and board, while the canners were often forced to pay for their own food and clothing. The conditions for canners were so bad that few of the original workers returned after one season. As Tenier explained in his memoirs, the Chinese community would warn any prospective candidates for the job to keep away from these Alaskan trips. So contractors had to resort to all kinds of devious methods to get enough men on board the ship. They even shanghaied many Mexicans and brought them on board without realizing that they were still where they were until the ship was on the high seas. The mixture of different nationalities in the canning job, united by poor and unfair working conditions, eventually created a multicultural unionizing effort that led to improvements, though this took many, many years. The Alaska Packers took advantage of the fact that these were many different people from different parts of the world with different languages and different cultures, but eventually they did come together and create some change. So Balclutha has had many careers. And while some might say Balclutha is now retired, I would argue that Balclutha is still in the middle of its most important career yet. Balclutha's current job is as preserver of heritage and as an educator. Many people from all over come to visit. Kids experience living history, as shown in these pictures here. And with the help of its newest crew, everyone at the Maritime Park Museum, the Research Center in San Francisco, Balclutha teaches us all about the origins of the city and the wider world in which we live. And hopefully we leave inspired, a bit wiser, and a bit more aware and empathetic of all the many ways in which we're all connected to each other through common threads like ships. Thank you.
Let me unmute myself here. Good job, Brandon. That's so exciting. I have not been, unfortunately, and I am a San Franciscan, I have not been to visit the Balclutha, but it's sure on my bucket list now.
Good.
What's the, is there a ticket line, or you have to get advance tickets for touring the Balclutha, or how does that work?
No, well, currently, unfortunately, everything's closed. So, but generally, there is a ticket, but you can visit the pier and walk on the pier, and then there's a ticket booth, and you go to the ticket booth and buy a ticket. And that ticket will help you. It's not just Balclutha. There's the Eureka, which is an old steam ferry. That's really neat, especially if you've taken the modern day ferry across the bay. This was the kind of ferry that was used before the bridges were built. So it was how people got across the bay. So there's one of those as well. There's the Alma, which is a lumber schooner that's there. So lots of different ships to see, and the ticket gets you onto all the different ships.
Oh, wow. That's great. And Brandon, again, thank you so much for your time. And at the end, I've got some questions from our members, if you don't mind answering. And at the end of this, we're going to close the meeting, but we're going to hang on for about 20 minutes in a big, giant chat room. And if you can join us in that, I'm sure that you'll get a lot more questions. So I invite you to stay on. Good. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to.
Some of the questions came in are pretty good. The potato patch that's outside the Golden Gate, what is that and why is it called that?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that, I admit.
Oh, okay.
I apologize. Yeah.
No problem. No problem.
I'm not a native San Franciscan, but I have been living here. I have been here for 6-7 years now. I love San Francisco. I'm from Southern California. My introduction to this world is it's sort of very like, well, this is why I mentioned world history when I first started. I'm actually a world historian, and that's how I got interested in ships, because of this history that they represent. And I decided when I was working on my dissertation and my now book project, that I wanted to focus on one ship and sort of see where that ship took me in my experience through history. That's what led me here. And so my experience with San Francisco history and with the local and that kind of thing really goes through. But if someone does know what that is, I'd be happy to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's a very treacherous part of the entrance to San Francisco Bay, and I know there's a lot of shipwrecks out there.
Oh, okay. So that's what. So that I hadn't heard that. I guess I hadn't heard that term referred to as that. But I'm well aware of that. There are many. It's been a very treacherous. For many decades. It's difficult. The fog, and interestingly, sort of connected to this, when the bay was first discovered, and some of you might already know this, but it was sailed past many, who knows how many times by Europeans before the first Spanish sailor actually noticed it, because of the way the bay is. That the entrance is so narrow, and because of the fog and the way the environment works, if you're just sailing up the coast, you can't necessarily see that there's a bay in there, that there's even an opening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brandon, what role did the Navy's Great White Fleet play in San Francisco maritime history?
Oh, the Great White Fleet. I do know a little bit about that. Certainly, and not much, I admit. I'm more of a world historian than a U.S. historian, but I've taught U.S. history at Cal Maritime. That is a very important part of West Coast history, certainly, because that is even more so when the West Coast becomes more of a center for the U.S. federal military and the Navy and things like that. And it was an effort to build up the U.S. Foreign power at a time when the U.S. was trying to become more and more involved in colonialism, which many European countries had been doing more directly for years. The West Coast and San Francisco especially came in a very important part of that. So I would look at it as one of the many different stages in terms of development of San Francisco. So if you look at, for example, the gold rush, of course, is essential. I mentioned the wheat being grown in the Central Valley, which is an essential industry, and agricultural became an essential industry for California. That's sort of seen as the second gold rush in a lot of ways, and they're connected though, because a lot of the people who got rich from the gold rush, a lot of the merchants who got rich from the gold rush, they're the ones who were buying up this land in the Central Valley. And so after the gold was sort of all gone and the rush had stopped, this was the next way for people to start making money. And so the Great White Fleet, certainly, I would say, definitely has an important part and an important part in terms of migrations at San Francisco too, bringing more military and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Can you talk about the shipwrecks that are still under what is now the Financial District and Lower Market Street in San Francisco? And how many are still under there?
I should know exactly how many. I don't know exactly how many, but it is a lot. It's surprising. There's actually, and if you visit the ships, there's a great visitor center across the street as well on Jefferson Street, the National Park Visitor Center, and the exhibit there is incredible. They have this great walkthrough exhibit that's pretty interactive, and you can see sort of different stages in San Francisco's history. And one of my favorite parts is when they're talking about these the ships buried under downtown, basically. And to me, I'm very interested in that. It's one of the most interesting things. San Francisco is just such a fascinating history, and so it shows you. So when the gold rush happened, when gold was first discovered, there were really only about 2,000 people in this area, right? It was really more of like a fishing town. And of course, gold was discovered, was announced by the president, and then worldwide, it just boomed. People are coming from all over the world, thousands of years, tens of thousands of people a year. And I think it was really just within a year, San Francisco went from 2,000 people to well over 20,000 people. So it's just incredible how quickly things boomed. And with that, of course, comes all of the development. At first, there's just shanty towns, things like that. But all of these people, and you need ships, and you need ships bringing things, and you need all of these things for all these people to live and to develop and build and all of that. San Francisco, the way it looks now, is not how the peninsula originally was.
Right.
Much of the land in the city is filled in land. And it's surprisingly, actually, when you look at the maps, a lot of it happened just in those first few years during the gold rush. So what these ships are basically is what happened is all of these ships coming in, so many ships coming in, and people men would sign on to these ships to work on these ships, and they'd sign a year contract, 2 years contract, whatever they could do, just because they knew it was coming to San Francisco. And then they would jump ship, they would break their contract and go into the hills because they really just wanted to get gold. So these ships were coming in, and the captains then had trouble. They couldn't leave because no one wanted to actually leave. No one wanted to crew the ships. Everyone wanted to come to find gold. But they were owned by all these other businessmen. They had to get out. They had to go get more things and come back. And that's why Shanghai became such a big business, why the Barbary Coast in San Francisco is so well known for, you could walk down the street and then you get banged over the head and you wake up and you're halfway across, somewhere else in the Pacific. It was a business, and it was an industry, and it had to be, because captains unfortunately had no choice. They had to work with these crimpers, they were called. That was the industry you were involved in. You were a crimper if that was your business. They had to work with them to get crew. So that all being said, because it was so difficult to get the ships out, sometimes they just couldn't find crew, and so the ship owners, because so many people were here and making a lot of money through gold and things like that, and they needed buildings. They didn't have time to even build buildings. It was all tents. So the owners found it more profitable to just sell the ships to the local people who were settling there, and these ships would be used as storehouses, as hotels, things like that. And the land, as it was filled in, further and further away from the coast, would be filled in around these ships, and they would become more of like an actual fixture. And so many of them then would just be built up over and over as the land was filled in over more and more and more. And there you have it. That's why there are so many ships underneath, and there's still archaeological digs, and they find all these neat things like giant tortoise shells from the Galapagos and various wines and things like that, just showing all of the stuff that was just coming in from all over the world to San Francisco during the period. But yeah, anytime you go to downtown, now really most of those skyscrapers and all those things that are now worried about sinking, it's because they're built on filled in land, and they're being supported in some ways, if you think about it, by ships. So San Francisco, I would say, is not only figuratively, the sort of way I was discussing, owes its history to ships like Balclutha. It's built on ships. It is also literally built on ships.
When the Metro Tunnel was being built around Union Square, they ran across a shipwreck as they were building that tunnel. And what are the protocols, the historical protocols in effect in the city of San Francisco when that happens? Do they stop all construction and do an archaeological dig?
Yes, they stop all construction. There are historians actually who work for the city and work for the state of California who worry about who would then come in specifically for things like that, and archaeologists, and they would stop, and then there would be assessments from the archaeologists, from the historians, from the experts, yeah, they would have to. I mean, I believe there are some where they just dug through, as I recall. But there would have had to have been some kind of assessment first,
Gotcha.
and some kind of dig first, and in most cases, I think especially today, they would have to figure out another route or something like that.
You mentioned in the building of the Balclutha and the wood involved, those masts have got to be super, super strong. What are they made of?
The masts themselves are made of steel.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the hull is steel, the masts are steel. A lot of the bulkheads, things like that, are iron. I pointed out the galley house too in the center. That's all
right.
Iron. Right. But though it's in pieces, actually, what's interesting. So in fact, now if you see Balclutha, and you can see it just by going to Fisherman's Wharf, I mean, you can see the masts and things like that. Balclutha is actually missing some of the masts because the steel only goes up to a certain height. I think it's like the top mast or the gallant, which, if you know ships, they're different. Each of the masts and the yards have certain names. So basically that's just like three yards up or so. Gotcha. And then there's a hole basically in the top. And right now on the pier, in fact, which is easier to do because there aren't people. So I guess one of the benefits of not having people there, as unfortunate as it is they're able to, right in the middle of the pier, they're actually, they've taken lumber and they're building now, they're shaping the rest of the mast. So most of the mast is steel, but when you start around the, I think it's a top gallon, like a gallon or so. So the royals and going up even further than that, that actually is all a giant wood piece that would go in, basically.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
During the end of the 19th century, and specifically you were talking about the gold rush era, that San Francisco Harbor was a center point of shipping in California. And why did we lose that title to Southern California, specifically the Long Beach harbor? What happened?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, it definitely happened in the 20th century. World War II had a big part in it, I would say. Yeah, but I haven't probably thought about it too much, but just based on sort of thinking now. World War II, definitely. San Diego, LA became very important ports during World War II for construction, for sending people out. San Francisco was too, of course, but that could be a big part of it. And then also, just as the sort of migrations change, Hollywood gets bigger and bigger in the 20th century, right? More people in the 50s and 60s especially start moving to Southern California. So just the sheer size of the population, I would imagine, had a huge impact on that as well. And as we know today, if you look at San Francisco, it's of course all built around the ships and things like that, but much of San Francisco now is sort of more tourism, right? It's more tourism based, and any of the ships, the ones I showed, when they're coming through the bay, they're going to Oakland, right? Oakland has sort of replaced it.
Sure.
In that regard. So I think that is connected to as well. So even more recently, the tech industry and stuff like that, and just sort of as economies change and as migration changes and populations change, that would impact as well where the shipping is coming and why.
Gotcha. Are there any shipwrecks in San Francisco that resulted in a significant or massive loss of life? I know every loss of life is significant, but is there any that stick out as being a major disaster?
Another good question. And unfortunately, the shipwreck specifically isn't something I'm especially knowledgeable, but I do know that there are of course the ones outside the bay, and something else that happened to like the ferries I mentioned, the ferry that's there, Eureka, the steam ferries, things like that, or even before steam ferries, before there were bridges, like I mentioned, that was how you got around the bay.
Yeah.
And we all know how foggy the bay can get, right? So you can imagine what it would have been like to sail or steam around the bay with so many ferries and ships going around. There were collisions. I wouldn't say often, I guess, but more often than you would like.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, there are some books that are even start that way that are, yeah.
There's, you mentioned about the crews that came in during the gold rush and then jumped ship, to go find their fortune in the hills. Were the crews paid well, or how were they paid?
Good question. Yeah, I'm glad that, because talking about the life on the ship more is something that I would love to talk more about. It's something I do research and write more about. Not well. Yeah, no, not this is the short answer. They were not paid well. They were not treated well. It was something. I mean, they were paid about as low as they possibly could be. There are incidents of what they would call like hell ships, where they were beaten if they didn't comply, or beaten if they did comply and just not comply enough. It depended sometimes on who the first mate was and who the captain was. But generally the first mate was a disciplinarian, and the first mate's could be very, very brutal, and they would beat them with belaying pins, which, if everyone knows a ship, are these big pins that often were made of teak, actually, that would be used to belay lines and things like that. They were common weapons on board ships. And when you look at instances of sailors trying to sort of fight that, it didn't work out to their advantage a lot of the time, because, so I mentioned the the differences. There's certainly racial considerations to be made, and then there's also class considerations to be made. I mentioned how the captains were often the sons of captains, and their father was often the son of a captain. I mean, it was generational, and part of that was money. You had to have money to train to be a captain, and also you had to have the connections, which they already did, right? So people could work up to be a captain if you started as a sailor, but there's this class difference too, and often sailors were very poor, low class laborers. Some of them didn't have any other opportunities or chances, and yeah, they weren't paid very well. They also, many people know about sailors, and they weren't known for spending their money well either. But
yeah, that's true.
They didn't have a lot of money to begin with, so they would not get a lot. They'd get in advance. They'd go and they'd do their trip, and they get the rest of their payment when they got there. They would go spend it, and then they didn't have much choice but to sign on to another ship. And they often didn't have choices of whether the ship was nice or not. Of course, over the years, and in fact, Balclutha existed in a period that was a sort of in-between time, especially in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is when sailor unions really start to get bigger and bigger and bigger and start fighting for more rights sailors. But then, of course, it's complicated, right? It's a world history, so that's only in certain places like Britain and the US, for example. So if you're American or if you're British, you might have some more rights because you've got some great unions. But if you're from other places, it's harder for you to find justice, I guess.
Good, thanks. One more question, Brandon, and then we're going to end the meeting. And if you can stay on afterwards, we'd appreciate it because there are more questions to ask. And was the Balclutha ever outfitted or retrofitted as a fighting ship? And did it ever fight in the wars?
It's a good question, because that's a good point. Most ships were, and that's one of the interesting things about Balclutha too. When you look at that period, Balclutha is one of the few ships from that period that actually was never involved in either World War I or World War II. It's just the way it worked out. So no, Balclutha wasn't, but it's a good question. As I said, there were most ships in some way were recommissioned, especially if they were steel-hulled ones like Balclutha. They could be used for other things during World War I. By the time World War II came around, there were these ships were already very endangered. So, but many ships like Balclutha did meet their fate by being sold to places who would then scrap them and use the steel to build more modern, like World War II era naval ships. In fact, many of these ships in Balclutha, there was a period where this almost happened to Balclutha in the 30s. Many of the ships were sold to Japan to be used for the steel to be used as part of the Japanese Imperial Navy at the time.
Wow. Okay, that takes care of these questions. We have more for you after the meeting's over, but this is the time for a commercial break. And you want to hawk your book?
Oh, hawk my book. Oh, well, it's a work in progress still. This was basically my dissertation, and yes, now I'm creating a proposal now to send off to publishers. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I hope that it will be. I would like to make it less of an academic book and more of a maybe in between, something that a lot of people would enjoy, that will reach to a lot of people. So I guess just be on the lookout for it. Yeah, hopefully within the next 2 years or so.
What's the name of the book, Brandon?
It'll be something similar to let's see, I had to like One Ship, Thousands of Lives is my main title. Just representing that following the ship through and how it's connected to so many different thousands of people and their livelihoods had depended on it. So
okay, good.
Yeah,
fair enough. Well, thank you, sir. That was very, very well done. Very informative, especially for us that have lived around the Bay Area for so long, and it becomes part of our culture. Of course, the San Francisco culture. Very, very interesting. Thank you. We do have a certificate for you, suitable for framing. You could put it right up there on the wall next to your PhD in history.
Oh, cool.
And we thank you very, very much for spending time with us. And this is the second time you've involved with our SIR group. And
yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very informative, Brandon. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
honored.
we've got a couple more things to go here. And Mike Thielen is our resident Golden Pipes guy, singing God Bless America. Mike, take it away.
Had to unmute myself. Brandon, excellent presentation. A lot of good information. I think I'll be first in line to get tickets when it's ready. So really appreciate it. The song we're going to sing is God Bless America. It is not Jailhouse Rock, as some people have thought. That's a bit of a stretch. So here we go. God Bless America. While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful for a land that's free. Let us all be grateful in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Great.
Thank you.
Well done, Mike. Thank you very, very much. Okay, now it's time for our drawing, and we're going to pick three names, or have picked three names from the participation list, the Zoom participation list. And the three winners of $25 check are Sam Martin. Way to go, Sam. The second one is Phil Davey. And the third is Karo Yoshizawa. So you guys will be getting checks from our treasurer, Gerald Surrey, within the next couple of days. And thanks for joining us. So that's it, guys. We will see you again on Wednesday, March 17th for our next meeting. And be well, be safe, be healthy. So long. So Joe's going to keep this meeting going for about 20 minutes. So I think he's going to turn everybody's mic on so you can ask Brandon questions directly. Okay. It's all yours, Joe. All righty.
Okay.
All right. Any questions for Brandon? We should have some. I know, Brandon, there was one that I didn't ask that came in. And how was the Balclutha retrofitted for different types of cargo?
So a couple ways. So I mentioned three careers. I didn't really get into detail of each one. The first career, of course, was mainly for wheat, bulk cargo. The second career was carrying lumber from the Pacific Northwest to Australia across the Pacific. So the first career, of course, that's what Balclutha was built for wheat, for bulk cargo. It wasn't anything needed necessarily there. When Balclutha became a lumber ship, and you can see these as well when you're visiting, especially with square riggers, there's too much rigging. So it's very difficult to bring the lumber into the hatches. So they had to create lumber hatches in the stern, basically, which are these sort of little ports they had to cut in to the back. And the lumber would be lowered in through the port. and straight directly into the hold, basically. So that's one thing that changed for that. The biggest, though, would be when Balclutha became Star of Alaska. I think it was 1911 was the exact year, I think. When you visit Balclutha now, you can see the shelter deck, which they call the shelter deck because it's this covered part of the deck. And it basically is an extension to the aft deck or the poop deck that extends it way out almost to midships. So it basically became this whole huge extra space that was used for living space. And that was where the fishermen would live, basically, or would live when they were sailing up and back from Alaska. Those are really the only differences which aren't too big, considering like someone asked about retrofitting the ships for war. Those would have been much different. Many of those, they would have taken the masts off. They would have turned them basically into like barges, but that never happened at Balclutha. So.
Okay, thank you. Larry Oliver, you had a question that popped up. Why don't you unmute yourself and ask Brandon directly? Larry, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a sense of how long some of these trips would take.
I'm sorry, what was that? I couldn't quite.
How long some of these trips would take from, say, San Francisco to Glasgow, or Glasgow down to India.
Mm-hmm. I think the trip from and they wouldn't go direct from Glasgow. They would usually, like Cardiff and Wales, they would usually load up with coal and stuff there and sail off from there. But it would take a few months, basically. And even that was pretty quick compared to what it used to take. I think there were some trips where they made it even faster than that, a month or a month and a half or so. The interesting thing is the technology changed. As the technology changed, it helped sailing ships as well. We often think of like the age of coal versus the age of sail, and that wasn't really how things worked. These ships actually existed together for different purposes. So things like steel hulls made it so that these sailing ships could be even bigger and lighter, which made them even faster. So generally they would take months. At least you would expect to have to travel months. You're traveling across Pacific, a month or so. So yeah. And then they would stop different places, of course, if they needed to take up other kinds of cargo. But one of the benefits of a sailing ship versus like a steamship is they didn't have to stop if they didn't need to. The only thing preventing them from stopping would have been food. They didn't have to refuel. They didn't have to do anything like that, which is why they're better for bulk cargo like wheat or lumber or nitrates. In the early 20th century, they were used for that. In fact, Germany was still building sailing ships similar to Balclutha and even bigger up until the 1920s and 30s, using them to trade with South America, nitrates and things like that.
Wow.
Yeah, I hope that.
Brandon, how long did was the Balclutha in service? And do you know how many trips it made outside of San Francisco?
Yeah, so its first career was based in the UK, and I don't know the exact number of trips. There was that. I can show this again just real quick. This is a really cool map that's on the ship, by the way.
That is awesome. Yeah.
Oh. So this shows all the trips basically. Every trip that Balclutha ever made, of the blue lines on here shows what where Balclutha went, and you can see it just depended. I mean, all over the place. Most of the trips around the Horn. There were, like I said, there were 17 trips around the Horn, and then it was 28 years. Balclutha was going from San Francisco up to Alaska, back and forth. So those were the biggest trips, but there were occasionally bulk cargo trips where, especially as the wheat trade died down a little bit before Balclutha started carrying lumber, where Balclutha would go around to South Africa. And here's an example too of how they might stop. They stopped like in Cape Town before going all the way to what was called Calcutta at the time. But so a lot of different trips all over the place. And like I mentioned, I sort of did my own very approximate calculations, which is why I said I didn't say exactly 440,000 miles total, but it actually was probably well over that. So a lot of miles sailing. And as I said, that's almost a trip to the moon and back, which is just incredible when you think about it, how much Balclutha sailed and where Balclutha went.
Wow.
Brandon, this is, can you hear me?
Yep.
Brandon, how, I don't know anything about canning. It seems to me to be a difficult process. How in the world could they have a canning process right on the ship? Can you explain that and how that took place?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So it wasn't actually on the ship. The ship itself was really just for transportation of people and supplies at that point. So the ship would take everyone up and all the supplies and everything they needed. Then when they got up to Alaska, they would have these little villages, basically little factories that were there that were seasonal. And so these buildings, these factory buildings would just boom, they would open up when the ship got there. Everyone would unload and everyone would actually live. The only person living aboard during the canning, the fishing season, would be the captain, and that was it. Everyone else was then housed on shore. They would all live ashore. All the fishermen lived ashore. All the canners lived ashore. So most of the equipment they would bring with them, but all of the actual canning, the fishing would all happen off of the ship. So the fishermen would go catch the fish, they'd bring them back, and then the canners, at first they would have to do everything. They would have to clean the fish, cut them up, prepare them, put them in the cans. And then basically what would happen after that is they would like cook the fish in the cans. So they would they would seal them up, they would put them in, they would basically like boil them in the cans and cook the fish in the can, and it sealed the can and it preserved them inside the can. And then, so what they were bringing back with them was just boxes and boxes full of all of these cans that they now had ready, prepared, labeled, painted, and ready to ship when they got back to San Francisco.
So that kind of explains why the canners weren't regarded very highly on the ship, because they were just load going to and from. They just sat there and they didn't participate in running the ship at all.
Well, the fishermen though were the same, and they had
Okay.
a nice cozy quarters upstairs. Yeah, and unfortunately, it really was. Race was a huge part of it. That they were all migrant workers from other places. They often were not American citizens yet, and like I said, they're contract laborers. So and it was all there were so many of them too, so many more canners than anyone else. So it was just a necessity almost for that to be the way.
Brandon, how many crew? What's the size of the crew on a typical sail?
So there was a story of Balclutha sailing across the channel, across the English Channel, on like a skeleton crew, and I think it was just about like 12 to 14 people. So that's pretty low. And I think I mentioned really briefly, but the usual crew you wanted was 30 to 35, including officers. So that'd be the sailors, the officers. The officers would be the captain, the captain, the first mate, the second mate. Often there'd be a third mate, but it didn't necessarily have to be. And then, of course, the steward. The steward, by the way, was the sort of personal cook of the captain and the officers. The officers always ate all their meals separately in that after cabin that I showed you. Everything was separate. It was a very, very different, separate worlds. So yeah, 30, 35, and that might include too as well the captain's wife and family, but that was generally the case.
Good. Any other questions? Go ahead.
You might have addressed one or both of these questions, but if you did, I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
As well, does the Balclutha still go out on the bay, say a tall ship celebration or trips for students and so forth? And the other question is, has it been used in any television or movies that we might keep our eye out for?
Good question. Yeah, and no, I didn't talk about either of those. So Balclutha cannot sail anymore, unfortunately. Balclutha's hull, the steel, is the original steel from Glasgow from 1886. So unfortunately, it's old steel. It hasn't lasted that long. In fact, the last time Balclutha was in dry dock, they had to almost completely repaint, not redo it, but they added an entire layer of steel plating along the water, below the water line, which is necessary because the steel just doesn't. So if Balclutha did sail, because whenever these ships, of course, sail, all of the lines, everything, all the sails, everything's attached to the hull. The hull is really what takes all the pressure, and so the steel hull just wouldn't be able to handle it anymore. There are ships though, like the Alma is a scow schooner, a smaller sailing boat that this park has that still sails and is Coast Guard certified, takes people out sometimes. And then the Thayer, which is the lumber schooner that I mentioned, a little bit smaller. The Thayer theoretically is able to sail. The problem is it just takes so much money. You have to get tugboats to tug it out of the cove there. And then you have to find people who actually know how to sail these ships, which are, few and far between anymore. But theoretically Thayer could sail. But Balclutha, unfortunately, no, doesn't anymore. But movies and things. Yes, one of the, there's an interesting period too in Balclutha's history when it was owned by a couple, basically. They're really interesting, and I can't get too into it. I guess the guys really want me to, but the man started his career as like a circus performer, basically, and he was sort of always looking for the next new thing. And that gives you an idea of the kind of person he was. He's just such an interesting character. And he bought Balclutha sort of on a whim because he heard that buying up these old sailing ships was a good way to make money. And he had all of these grand plans about sailing Balclutha around the world and all this kind of stuff. It ended up Balclutha was just sort of their home, him and his wife's home. And she was very big there too. And she learned how to sail and navigate, and she has her own interesting history. Anyway, so during that period, they tried as hard as they could to make money from the ship that they had bought and invested in, and it wasn't usually successful. But one of the things they did was try and sell it out to movie companies. And so Balclutha was actually in Mutiny on the Bounty, the old black and white and it was in the back. There's a scene of Bristol, and there's like 3 ships, and Balclutha is one of the background ships, and they had to sort of repaint just half of the ship to be in that scene. But yeah.
Okay, good. Let's have one more question for Brandon. Anybody?
Yeah, did you indicate what the origin of the name Balclutha was and how it got named that?
I didn't. Another question. I appreciate it. There's always little things that I just can't, I can't really mention or bring up in the time, right? I had to kind of like, as I'm creating things, I have to kind of be like, I guess I got to cut that. No, but then that's very important. But so Balclutha is, and it's connected as well to the things I was talking about. Glasgow wouldn't be the city it is today either without the shipbuilding industry from this period that developed because of these other industries around the world, right? And you go to Glasgow today, and they know this, and they're so proud of that industry, and they were at the time too. And they're a very local shipbuilding business community. So Balclutha is an example of that. Balclutha, many ships were named like the Falls of Clyde or things like that after regions or parts of the area. So Balclutha comes from the Scottish Gaelic, which literally means city on the River Clyde. There are different people who interpret different ways, like a rock on the River Clyde or things like that. But basically, it's a sort of poetic testament to Glasgow itself and the city. And interestingly, there is a town in New Zealand that's named Balclutha as well, which has no connection, though some people have thought there was a connection. But it is really, what it is more likely is that the town was founded by immigrants from the Glasgow area who then went to New Zealand. And so it obviously is, at least for Glaswegians, this is a term that they knew of coming from the Scottish Gaelic for Glasgow that was used other occasions as well.
Good. Well, Brandon, thank you very, very much for hanging out with us. And I give you one more opportunity to hawk your book or your future book. And what's the title again?
One Ship, Thousands of Lives. And it might change as it gets published. I don't know. Publishers
okay.
Want to but that's what my project is called right now. One Ship, Thousands of Lives.
And publication date is when?
I don't have one yet. I'm creating my proposal to send to publication. But I'm confident it'll be picked up, hopefully. But it just depends on where and who. But
I know you have a relationship with Randy Wong, and let me invite you to, when that does happen next year, or the year after, or whatever, send Randy a note, and we'll give you a little bit of press on the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we certainly appreciate your time. All right, guys, we'll see you next month. Joe, take us out of here.
He has to sing God Bless America again, though, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, Joe.
All right.
You could also name your book Ship Happens.
That's a good. I'll mark that right now on my phone to remember that.
And when you're fired and go to the cannery, you're ship canned.
You got to understand, like, he's also the one that put in there that when we talk about the elephants, it's the elephant in the Zoom. Mike needs to get out more often.
Guess who's the class clown?
That's
huh?
great. Yeah.
I just hang out with the wine group. That's all.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.